Plans changed. You and the boys aren't coming. We need the right optics for the Aspen trip. Real family only. My stepmother sent that text at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. I read it twice. Behind me, my 7-year-old sons were arguing over who got to pack the neon ski goggles, their little snow boots already lined up by the door. I set the phone face down on the cold granite counter before they could see my face. I didn't cry. My name is Morgan, and that single text message just cost her an empire. If you have ever had to hide a cruel text message from your children, tell me where you are listening from below. I chose silence. I walked over to the kitchen table where my sons were comparing their winter gloves. The neon fabric was bright against the dark wood. Noah looked up, his eyes wide and trusting. Is the snow going to be really deep? Mom, he asked. I looked at his small, eager face. I looked at Sam, who was struggling to click his plastic helmet strap into place. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly thin, as if someone had opened a window to a winter storm. I knelt down so I was eye level with them. I gently reached out and unclipped Sam's helmet. Boys, I said, keeping my voice entirely steady. We are going to pivot. We are going on a different kind of adventure this weekend. I watched the confusion wash over them. They did not cry, but the light dimmed in their eyes. That is the thing about children. They accept the weather you set for them. I told them the mountain was too crowded, that we would go to the massive indoor water park 2 towns over instead. It was a good lie. A safe lie. I reached for Noah's blue backpack. I gripped the small metal tab of the zipper. The sound of that zipper opening, moving along the teeth to reveal the carefully folded snow pants inside, was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It sounded like tearing fabric. It sounded like an ending. I took the snow pants out, I took the heavy socks out, I folded them and placed them on the nearest chair. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. I was 32 years old. And for a long time, I had played the role of the quiet, accommodating stepdaughter. I had accepted the subtle exclusions, but looking at my son's half-empty backpacks, something fundamental shifted in my chest. The coldness that settled over me was not grief. It was absolute crystalline clarity. Veronica had used the words right optics. She had used the words real family only. She had typed them out and sent them through a cellular network, completely unaware of the architecture she was dismantling. She thought she was putting me in my place. She thought she was protecting the pristine image of the Sterling family legacy for the glossy magazine covers. She had no idea what she had just done. She did not know that her text message was not merely a rejection. It was a legal trigger. It was the exact condition required to bring her entire carefully curated world crashing down to its foundations. I packed their swimsuits. I zipped the bags back up. I gave them each a reassuring smile. Then, I walked back to the granite counter and picked up my phone. I did not text her back. I did not demand an explanation or plead for my sons to be included. Pleading is for people who do not hold the keys. I locked the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. I had work to do. The trap was set. I am a restoration architect. I spend my days walking through old, forgotten structures, reading the stories written in their load-bearing walls and sagging floorboards. My job is not to make things look pretty. My job is to find the hidden fractures. I look for the rot behind the pristine plaster. I calculate the exact weight a compromised beam can take before the entire roof caves in. It is meticulous, quiet work. It requires patience and a profound respect for the structural truth of a building, regardless of how beautiful the facade might be. That morning, after I dropped Noah and Sam off at school, I drove to my office in the historic district. The irony of my profession was never lost on me, especially when it came to my own family. The Sterling family was a grand, imposing estate in the eyes of the public. 50 years of corporate success, galas, and charity balls had built a gleaming exterior, and Veronica was the ultimate curator of that facade. She was a woman who spent her entire life polishing the windows, ensuring everyone looking in saw nothing but perfection. She was obsessed with appearances, with the right lighting, the right guest lists, the right zip codes. But Veronica never understood foundations. She never understood that a house cannot stand on optics alone. When my father married her, I was just a quiet child who liked to draw floor plans. She brought Caroline with her, a daughter from her previous marriage, and immediately began redecorating our lives to fit her vision. Caroline was moulded into the perfect socialite, the gleaming heir apparent to the Sterling image. I was merely an architectural afterthought, something to be worked around, hidden in the shadows, or excluded entirely when the cameras were rolling. For years, I let her play her games. I let her dictate the seating charts and the holiday invitations. I focused on my work. I built a successful firm from the ground up, entirely independent of the Sterling money. I learned how to brace collapsing structures and how to pour concrete that would last a century. I became an expert at identifying the exact point of structural failure. And as I sat at my drafting table that Tuesday, staring at the blueprints of a 19th century courthouse, I applied that same clinical analysis to Veronica. She was a weak beam. She had been taking on too much weight, assuming the entire structure would simply hold because it always had. She thought her control over the Sterling Lodge in Aspen was absolute. She thought she could dictate who belonged in the family and who was disposable. She thought she was the architect of our lives, but she was just a tenant living in a house she did not understand. She was blindly hacking away at the load-bearing walls, completely unaware of the blueprints that had been drawn up long before she ever arrived. I picked up my red pen. I marked the floors. The silence of my office was usually a comfort, a space where I could untangle complex geometries. But today, the silence felt heavy, charged with a strange electricity. I set the architectural blueprints aside and opened my laptop. It was the first week of the month, the time I typically reviewed the automated financial reports. Among them was the preliminary tax filing draft for the Sterling Winter Hearth Fund. The charity had been established decades ago, supposedly to help children without stable homes experience the magic of winter camps. On paper, it was the crown jewel of Veronica's philanthropic portfolio. She hosted an annual gala for it, wearing custom gowns and giving tearful speeches about the importance of family and belonging. The sheer hypocrisy of her excluding my sons that very morning while preparing to host an anniversary party under the banner of family values made my stomach turn. But I did not deal in emotions. I dealt in data. I dealt in structural integrity. I opened the spreadsheet detailing the fund's annual disbursements. Row after row of catering costs, event security, and venue rentals for the galas. It was a massive machine designed to burnish Veronica's social standing. I scrolled down, my eyes tracking the numbers automatically. Then, my cursor stopped. There was a recurring line item under a category vaguely labelled as private consulting and external settlements. It was not a small number. It was a substantial, 5-figure sum, disbursed quarterly without fail. I moved my mouse to the recipient column. The name meant nothing to me at first glance. Graham Vale. I stared at the bright white screen. Graham Vale. I did not know any consultants by that name. The charity had no legitimate reason to be making quarterly private settlements to an individual with no public ties to the organisation. I highlighted the row. I checked the previous year's records. There it was again. Graham Vale. I checked the year before that. The payment stretched back consistently for a decade. My mind began to work through the puzzle, assembling the pieces with the cold logic of an engineer, a secretive, recurring payment drawn from a charity meant for orphans, authorised by a woman who obsessed over maintaining a flawless public image. It was a structural anomaly. It was a crack in the foundation that was deliberately hidden behind the drywall. I did not have the full picture yet, but I knew I had found a critical point of failure. Veronica was terrified of things that did not look right. She was terrified of the messy, the complicated, and the unpolished. What could compel a woman like that to siphon charity funds into a private account year after year? The answer had to be something that threatened her perfect facade. I copied the name and the transaction histories into a secure, encrypted file on my hard drive. I did not know who Graham Vale was at that moment. I only knew that his name was the thread I needed to pull. It would unravel everything. Seeing the name Graham Vale glowing on my screen brought a rush of old, buried memories to the surface. It brought me back to the exact feeling of standing on the outside, looking through a frosty window at a warm room. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, standing on the expansive front porch of the Stirling Lodge. It was the winter my father had decided to commission an official family portrait to hang in the grand entryway. The photographer had set up heavy lights and silver umbrellas on the snow-covered deck. Veronica was in her element, directing the scene with sharp, clipped commands. She had dressed Caroline in a pristine white velvet coat with a fur trim. Caroline, her biological daughter, was the picture of winter elegance. I was wearing a dark navy parka, practical and warm, but entirely wrong for the aesthetic Veronica was trying to achieve. I remember stepping into the frame, trying to find a place beside my father. Veronica had immediately stepped forward, her smile tight and painted on. She placed a hand firmly on my shoulder and gently, but immovably, steered me out of the camera's view. "Morgan, sweetheart," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Your coat simply clashes with the palette we are going for. Why don't you step just right over there for this shot? We will do a casual one with you later." Later. Of course. Never came. I stood exactly where she told me to, out in the biting cold, wrapping my arms around myself as the flashes went off. Years later, I found the original, uncropped proof of that photograph hidden in a desk drawer. Veronica had framed the perfect, cropped version. Just her, my father, and Caroline smiling radiantly against the snowy backdrop. But in the raw proof, if you looked closely at the very bottom right edge, you could see them. The tips of my dark winter boots, standing just outside the boundary of their perfect world. It was a quiet, devastating kind of psychological exile. She had not hit me, she had not yelled, she had simply erased me. But Veronica did not know that my grandmother, Estelle, had also seen that uncropped proof. Estelle was a woman of fierce intelligence and quiet observation. Before she passed, she had given me a small, sealed box. Inside was a copy of that exact photograph, the one with my boots at the edge. I turned the stiff photo paper over, written on the back, in Estelle's elegant, slanted handwriting, was a single sentence. This is the day I understood Veronica did not want a family. She wanted a beautiful composition. Estelle had seen the rot long before anyone else. She had known that Veronica's obsession with optics would eventually consume everything real in our lives. I opened my eyes and looked back at the spreadsheet on my laptop. The memory of the cold snow seeping through my boots was replaced by a rising, focused heat. The days of standing outside the frame were over. I grabbed my keys. I drove back to my house in silence, the heater humming softly against the winter chill. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, steady and firm. For years, people who knew the fringes of our family dynamic had silently wondered why I stayed. Why did a successful architect endure the constant, subtle humiliations from a stepmother who clearly despised her? The answer was hidden in a bank ledger. Every single month, on the first day of the month, exactly $5,500 left my account. It went directly into the family property maintenance account. Veronica had established that account shortly after my father passed away. She had sat me down in the sunroom, her voice coated in a sugary, manufactured concern. She told me that keeping the Sterling Lodge operational was a massive burden. She told me that if I wanted Noah and Sam to have a place in the family legacy, I needed to shoulder my portion of the duty as a future beneficiary. She made it sound noble. She made it sound like an initiation fee for a club I desperately wanted my children to join. Psychologists have a term for it: learned helplessness. When you are conditioned from childhood to believe that you have no power, you stop trying to find the exit. You simply learn to survive within the cage. Veronica had spent decades teaching me that my presence in the Sterling family was conditional. I was a guest who had to pay for her seat at the table. I paid that $5,500 not because I was wealthy enough to ignore it, and certainly not because I was stupid. I paid it because I was terrified. I was terrified that if I stopped, Veronica would seamlessly execute what she had been threatening to do since I was 8 years old. She would erase my sons completely. I was paying a monthly ransom to keep a phantom door open. I believed I was buying them a future. I believed I was buying them a grandmother and an aunt. But you cannot buy genuine affection from people who view you as an aesthetic inconvenience. You only fund their delusions. I parked my car in the driveway and turned off the engine. The silence in the cabin was absolute. I realised then that my ransom payments had never been a chain holding me down. They were a paper trail. I had been building a fortress. The Sterling Lodge was a magnificent structure, built with massive timber beams and rough-hewn stone. It was designed to withstand avalanches and decades of heavy snow. The woman who built it was exactly the same. Estelle Sterling, my grandmother, was the original architect of our family's wealth. She was a woman of sharp angles and uncompromising standards. While Veronica obsessed over the floral arrangements and the society column mentions, Estelle scrutinised the quarterly revenue reports. Estelle was the only person in that sprawling, suffocating family who saw me. She never asked me to change my winter coat for a photograph. When the extravagant holiday parties became too loud, filled with Veronica's sycophantic friends, Estelle would quietly catch my eye. A single nod. That was my cue. I would slip away to her private study, the only room in the house where Veronica was explicitly forbidden to enter. It smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and peppermint tea. In that room, I was not the awkward stepdaughter. I was simply Morgan. Estelle would teach me how to read architectural blueprints, her gnarled finger tracing the load-bearing walls. She taught me that a structure is only as strong as its deepest, most hidden foundation. She saw right through Veronica's manicured facade. She knew that my father's second marriage was built on vanity, not substance. But Estelle was a strategist. She never caused a public scene. She never engaged in petty domestic warfare. A few months before she died, Estelle called me into that quiet study for the last time. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her eyes were like dark flint. She pressed a small, heavy silver key into my palm. It was cold to the touch. She folded my fingers over it. "Do not fight for a place in a fake picture, Morgan," she had whispered, her voice raspy but firm. "Let them have the camera. You hold the deed." I had carried that silver key on my keyring for over 10 years. It had jingled against my car keys every time I drove to Aspen, every time I handed over my credit card to pay for Veronica's maintenance bills. I had thought the key was merely a sentimental keepsake, a piece of a grandmother who loved me. I did not realise it was a weapon. I did not realise Estelle had spent the last years of her life laying down a legal minefield. She had seen the future. I walked into my quiet house, the winter boots thudding softly against the hardwood floor. I made a cup of black coffee and carried it to my home office. I needed to see exactly how Veronica and Caroline were framing this weekend. I pulled up my personal social media accounts. I rarely posted, preferring the anonymity of my work, but I kept them active for professional monitoring. I typed Caroline's name into the search bar. Her profile was public, a carefully curated grid of luxury brands, flawless makeup, and high society charity events. There was a bright pink ring around her profile picture, indicating a new story had been posted within the last hour. I clicked it. The screen filled with a sweeping panoramic video of the snow-capped peaks in Aspen. The camera panned down to reveal the grand, rustic deck of the Stirling Lodge. A massive fire roared in the outdoor stone pit. Caroline stepped into the frame. She was wearing an impossibly pristine white ski suit, holding a steaming mug of cocoa. She smiled brilliantly into the lens. At the bottom of the screen, written in elegant, cursive text, was a caption. Finally, a real family vacation. No drama, no kids ruining the mood, just pure Stirling tradition. I watched the short video loop 3 times. I watched Caroline's perfect smile. I read the words real family again. A younger version of me might have shattered right there. A younger version of me would have cried, feeling the familiar hollow ache of being permanently locked out in the cold. I would have wondered what was so fundamentally wrong with my sons that their own aunt viewed them as mood-ruining drama. But I did not feel an ounce of sorrow. I felt a cold, sharp precision. Caroline was a socialite, trained by her mother to document every luxurious moment for public consumption. She thought she was establishing her status. She thought she was projecting an image of exclusive, upper-crust perfection. She had no concept of the legal machinery quietly humming beneath the floorboards of the very deck she was standing on. I pressed the 2 buttons on my phone required to take a screenshot. The screen flashed white for a fraction of a second. The image was saved directly to my encrypted file. Caroline had just taken Veronica's private, cruel text message and broadcasted the exact same discriminatory sentiment to 50,000 followers. She had given me public, time-stamped proof of their intent. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. They were digging their own graves. The coffee was bitter, exactly how I needed it to be. I set the mug down next to my laptop. The screenshot of Caroline's post was safely filed away, a digital brick in the wall I was building. Now, it was time to cut the main power line. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to my private banking portal. I typed in my credentials, the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard echoing in the empty room. The dashboard loaded, displaying my balances and upcoming scheduled transfers. There it was, sitting under the Pending Transactions tab. A scheduled automatic transfer, $5,500. Destination, the Stirling Lodge Operating Trust. Scheduled date tomorrow morning. For 9 years, that number had been a constant, bleeding wound in my finances. It was the price of admission for a family that actively despised my children. I stared at the bold black numbers on the bright screen. $5,500. I thought about Noah's small hands trying to clip his ski helmet. I thought about the uncropped photograph with my boots standing in the snow. I thought about the word optics. The money had never bought love. It had only bought Veronica's temporary, disdainful tolerance. By paying it, I had actively participated in my own subjugation. I moved the cursor over the transaction line. A small drop-down menu appeared. Edit, suspend, cancel. My hand hovered over the trackpad. People often believe that acts of severe retaliation require screaming matches and shattered glass. They believe vengeance must be loud. They are wrong. The most devastating destruction happens in absolute silence. It happens when someone simply stops holding up the ceiling. I did not hesitate. My hand did not shake. I clicked the word cancel. A dialog box popped up on the screen. asking me to confirm the deletion of a recurring scheduled transfer. I clicked to confirm. The screen refreshed. The pending transaction vanished from the ledger, leaving a clean, empty white space in its wake. A soft, automated chime emitted from my laptop speakers, signalling that the action was complete. That tiny digital sound was the entirety of my rebellion. No fanfare, no dramatic declarations. By noon, the quiet, steady stream of capital that kept Veronica's lavish Aspen lifestyle afloat had completely dried up. She was sitting in a multi-million-dollar lodge, hosting an extravagant anniversary party, entirely unaware that the financial ground beneath her designer snow boots had just vanished. I closed the banking tab and leaned back in my chair. The quiet was beautiful. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across my living room. I walked into the kitchen to start dinner. It was Tuesday night. Ordinarily, the week before the annual Aspen trip was a nightmare of logistical anxiety. I would spend hours agonizing over what clothes to pack for the boys, terrified that a mismatched sweater would draw Veronica's sharp, disparaging sighs. I would rehearse polite responses to Caroline's inevitable passive-aggressive comments. My stomach would be tight with a low-grade, constant dread. Tonight, there was nothing. I pulled a box of pasta from the pantry and set a pot of water on the stove to boil. Noah and Sam were in the living room, building an elaborate fortress out of sofa cushions and heavy blankets. Their laughter drifted into the kitchen, loud and uninhibited. They were not worried about breaking a priceless vase. They were not tiptoeing around trying to be perfectly invisible. They were simply being 7 years old. I watched the water begin to bubble. The absence of Veronica's toxic gravity felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I realised I had spent my entire adult life bracing for impact. I had structured my existence around minimising their displeasure. But without the looming spectre of the Sterling family anniversary, my house felt incredibly light. It was warm. It was safe. I stirred the pasta, watching the steam rise toward the ceiling. I did not mourn the loss of the Aspen trip. I did not mourn the loss of a family connection, because the connection had never truly existed. You cannot lose a phantom. When you finally stop pouring your energy into people who treat you like an inconvenience, the void they leave behind is not empty. It is filled with peace. I listened to Noah shout a command to Sam about defending their cushion castle from an imaginary dragon. I set the plates on the small wooden table. We ate dinner in our pajamas. We talked about the water park and the giant slides we would conquer this weekend. I looked at their messy faces and their bright, untroubled eyes. Veronica had called them a disruption to her optics. She had barred them from her pristine, snowy stage. She thought she had punished us. She had actually set us free. I cleared the empty plates from the table and loaded the dishwasher. I was ready for tomorrow. The soft humming of the dishwasher was the only sound in the kitchen. I stood by the window, watching the moonlight reflect off the frost on the lawn. Then, the black rectangle of my phone on the granite counter began to vibrate. It moved slightly against the stone, emitting a low, urgent buzz. The screen illuminated the darkened room. Veronica. I watched her name flash in bright white letters. It buzzed until the call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started again. Caroline. I picked up a glass and filled it with cold tap water. I did not reach for the phone. I leaned against the counter and simply watched it demand my attention. Over the next 40 minutes, 14 separate missed calls accumulated on the screen. The ripple effect of a cancelled digital transaction takes a specific amount of time to travel from a bank server to a luxury resort in Aspen. I could perfectly visualise the sequence of events unfolding 1,000 miles away. Veronica was likely standing in the grand foyer of the Sterling Lodge, surrounded by event planners and florists setting up for the 50th anniversary gala. She would have handed over the platinum card tied to the family property maintenance account to pay a vendor, perhaps the caterer delivering the imported caviar or the designer installing the custom ice sculptures. The vendor would have run the card through their mobile terminal. A small red error message would have appeared. Declined. Veronica would have laughed it off initially, calling it a ridiculous banking glitch. She would have confidently handed them a second card, only to find that the primary account backing it had been completely zeroed out. The sudden, humiliating realization that she could not cover the exorbitant costs of her own vanity project in front of her high society guests would have been a physical blow. The panic would have set in immediately, followed swiftly by outrage. She needed the silent beam holding up her ceiling to fix it. The phone vibrated for the 15th time. I took a slow sip of water. For 32 years, my body had been conditioned to respond to her demands with immediate anxious compliance. If she called, I answered. If she demanded funding for her optics, I paid, but the chain had been severed. The conditioning was gone. The woman holding the glass of water in this quiet kitchen was not the obedient stepdaughter. She was an architect watching a flawed structure begin to sway. I set the glass down. The phone eventually gave up, leaving the kitchen in absolute peace. I walked back into my home office and opened a fresh, encrypted folder on my desktop. I needed more than just the cancelled transaction confirmation. I needed the full scope of the financial architecture I had unwittingly constructed over the past decade. I logged back into my bank's archival system and initiated a comprehensive query for every transfer sent to the family property maintenance account. The system took a moment to process. Then, a long, continuous list populated the screen, row after row of black text. $5,500. Every single month, on the first of the month, spanning exactly 9 years. 108 individual transactions. I exported the data into a pristine spreadsheet. I formatted the columns meticulously, ensuring every date, routing number, and confirmation code was perfectly aligned. The total sum at the bottom of the page was staggering, nearly $600,000. That money could have been a college fund for Noah and Sam. It could have been invested, grown, and used to secure our own independent future. Instead, it had been funneled into the wood-burning fireplaces and designer furnishings of a lodge where my children were deemed unfit to enter. But as I stared at the spreadsheet, I did not feel regret. I felt a cold, validating clarity. Veronica had intended for those payments to be my quiet submission. She had intended for them to be a secret tax on my existence in her family. She did not realise that in the realm of asset management and legal disputes, consistent, documented financial contributions establish an undeniable trail of responsibility. While she was busy curating her image and posing for the cameras, I had been paying the taxes. I had been paying the structural insurance. I had been funding the men who repaired the roof and cleared the snow. I generated a secure, unalterable PDF of the entire financial history. I connected my laptop to the heavy-duty office printer. The machine whirred to life, pulling crisp white sheets of paper through its rollers. The sound was rhythmic and productive. I stood by the output tray and gathered the warm, printed pages. They formed a thick, substantial stack in my hands. It was the exact dimension of my exploitation, beautifully bound in black ink. It was not a record of weakness. It was a record of ownership. I held the structural proof. I laid the stack of financial records on my drafting table, right next to the blueprints of the 19th century courthouse I was restoring. In my profession, you quickly learn that the most dangerous forces acting upon a building are entirely invisible. You cannot see the moisture slowly rotting a foundation, and you cannot see the microscopic stress fractures spreading through a cast iron pillar. You only see the result when gravity finally wins. The Sterling family, under Veronica's directorship, was a masterclass in structural self-deception. She had built her entire social standing on the assumption that the wealth and the legacy were her inherent rights. She treated the assets as props for her personal brand. She brought Caroline into the fold and positioned her as the rightful heir to a history she had no part in building. They operated under the delusion that looking wealthy was the exact same thing as being wealthy. But a house cannot support itself on sheer arrogance. It requires load-bearing elements. For 9 years, my quiet compliance and my monthly payments had been the invisible steel beams keeping the Aspen Lodge operational. Veronica had assumed I would never move. She assumed my fear of being entirely excluded would keep me anchored in place, endlessly absorbing the weight of her financial mismanagement. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the material she was working with. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark, quiet street. I felt a profound sense of professional detachment. When an architect identifies a building that is beyond repair, they do not feel anger toward the decaying wood, they simply draft the demolition plan. I had removed the central pillar holding up Veronica's extravagant lifestyle. The sway had already begun. The missed calls were just the initial creaking of the timber. Soon, the entire facade would begin to crack. The impending collapse was not a tragedy. It was a necessary correction. Estelle had known this. She had designed her trust to outlast the vanity of her successors. She knew that eventually, Veronica would push too far, assume too much authority, and trigger the fail-safes hidden deep within the legal framework. My job was no longer to brace the failing walls. My job was simply to step back and let the physics of consequence take over. Gravity always wins eventually. The red notification light on my phone blinked steadily in the darkness of the kitchen. A new voicemail. I pressed the screen and activated the speakerphone. I wanted the sound of her voice to fill the space, unfiltered and clear. A sharp inhale of breath preceded the words. It was Veronica, and she was not calling to apologize. The tone was not panicked. It was furious, dripping with the entitled condescension I had endured my entire life. Morgan, I do not know what kind of childish tantrum you are throwing with the maintenance account, but it is entirely unacceptable. Her voice echoed off the granite counters. The caterers for the anniversary are demanding their deposit. You need to call your bank and fix this immediately. And while I have you, I expect that corporate restructuring document signed and overnighted to my assistant by tomorrow. I am tired of your passive-aggressive delays. She paused, taking a breath to deliver the final, calculated blow. Fix this account error now, Morgan, or those 2 boys of yours will permanently lose their privileges at the Sterling Lodge. I will not have my family legacy burdened by your endless drama. The recording ended with a sharp click. The automated voice informed me I had no saved messages. I stood in the quiet kitchen, letting her words settle into the room. She had used the exact threat she had wielded for years. She thought she was applying leverage. She thought the threat of completely excluding Noah and Sam would send me rushing to the bank to restore her funding. She believed that isolating my children was the ultimate weapon to guarantee my obedience. She was completely blind to the reality of the situation. Veronica did not understand that she had not just left a nasty voicemail. She had left a recorded, time-stamped confession of extortion. She had explicitly tied the financial maintenance of the property to a demand that I sign away my corporate rights, while simultaneously using the emotional well-being of minors as a bargaining chip. She had given me everything I needed. She had handed me the green light on a silver platter. I deleted the message, knowing my service provider automatically archived a backup. She gave me the permission. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the frost on my windshield. The boys were safely at school, entirely oblivious to the storm gathering over Aspen. I walked back into my bedroom and opened the small velvet-lined jewellery box sitting on my dresser. I pushed past the earrings and the delicate necklaces until my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out the heavy, tarnished silver key Estelle had pressed into my hand all those years ago. It was an old-fashioned safety deposit key, stamped with a serial number and the emblem of a private bank located in the heart of the city's financial district. For 10 years, I had kept it hidden, viewing it as a quiet reminder of the only woman in the Sterling family who had ever truly seen me. Today, it was no longer a keepsake. It was the combination to a lock I was finally ready to open. I dropped the key into my purse alongside the thick stack of financial printouts and the screenshot of Caroline's social media post. I put on my heavy wool coat and locked the front door of my house. I did not drive toward my architectural firm. I merged onto the highway and headed straight for the glass and steel towers downtown. The air in the car was crisp and my mind was incredibly clear. The transition was complete. I was no longer the quiet stepdaughter waiting by the edge of the frame, hoping to be invited in. I was the property owner arriving to collect the keys. If you have ever kept evidence of someone's toxicity for years, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to use it, tell me in the comments if you know this exact feeling of cold clarity. I parked in the underground garage of a sleek, imposing high-rise. The directory in the lobby listed the prestigious law firm of Arthur and Associates on the 42nd floor. Arthur had been Estelle's personal counsel for 3 decades. He was a man who spoke little and documented everything. He was the guardian of the blueprints. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The smooth, silent ascent felt like rising above the weather. The heavy glass doors slid open. The receptionist at Arthur and Associates did not ask for my name. She simply nodded and escorted me down a quiet, carpeted hallway to a corner office overlooking the city. Arthur was standing by a massive mahogany desk, looking exactly as he had a decade ago. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of unwavering calm. He gestured for me to sit in one of the heavy leather chairs opposite him. He did not offer condolences for the cancelled trip. He knew why I was there. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick stack of financial records, sliding them across the polished wood. I placed the screenshot of Caroline's social media post on top. Arthur adjusted his glasses and spent 5 silent minutes reading through the documents. He did not show surprise. He simply nodded, aligning the edges of the paper with methodical precision. He looked up at me, his hands folding neatly over the files. "Your grandmother was a brilliant woman, Morgan," he said softly. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, cream-coloured folder, sealed with a heavy wax stamp. "People misunderstand how wealth transfer actually works," Arthur explained, tapping the folder. "They think a will is the ultimate authority, but a will is just a list of wishes, subject to probate, public scrutiny, and endless legal challenges. Estelle did not write a will for her core assets. She established an irrevocable trust. Do you understand the difference?" I nodded, my architectural background making the concept clear. An irrevocable trust is not a wish. It is a vault. "The trust already owns the Sterling Lodge," Arthur continued. "It has owned it since the day she signed this document 24 years ago. Veronica was never the owner. She was merely a conditional occupant." He opened the folder and turned to a heavily bookmarked page. Estelle anticipated that Veronica's obsession with optics would eventually target the most vulnerable members of this family. So, she embedded a structural fail-safe. We call it the Equal Hearth Clause. I leaned forward, reading the dense legal text. The clause stated explicitly that no minor beneficiary, whether by blood, adoption, or legal guardianship, could ever be barred from utilising the family properties for reasons pertaining to social standing, public image, or familial optics. Any attempt by an occupant to exclude a child on these grounds would instantly constitute a material breach of the trust's conditions. By sending that text message, and by allowing Caroline to boast about excluding your children for a pristine aesthetic, Veronica did not just insult you, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. She triggered an automatic, non-negotiable freeze on her right to occupy the property. The pieces snapped together perfectly. Estelle had built a flawless legal maze, waiting patiently for Veronica's arrogance to lead her directly into a dead end. The trap snapped shut. Arthur closed the trust document and looked at my purse. "Do you have the key she gave you?" he asked quietly. I retrieved the heavy silver key and handed it across the desk. It felt warm from my hands. Arthur stood up, walked to a massive landscape painting on the far wall, and swung it outward to reveal a dark steel safe. He spun the combination dial with practiced efficiency, inserted my silver key into the secondary lock, and turned it. The heavy metal door opened with a heavy, satisfying click. He reached inside and pulled out a grey metal lockbox, carrying it back to the desk. Estelle knew that the equal hearth clause would remove Veronica from the property, Arthur explained. But she also knew Veronica would fight it in the court of public opinion. She knew Veronica would weaponize the concept of pure sterling bloodlines against you. So, Estelle made sure you had the ammunition to dismantle that specific illusion. Arthur unlocked the grey box and produced a stack of financial audit reports bound by a thick rubber band. They bore the logo of an independent forensic accounting firm. I recognised the name immediately. It was the same firm that audited the massive commercial projects my company managed. "These are the true ledgers for the Sterling Winter Hearth Fund," Arthur said, sliding them toward me. "The charity Veronica uses to host her galas for orphans." I opened the first report. The same name I had found in my own brief search was highlighted in yellow throughout the documents. Graham Vale. But these reports contained far more than just transfer amounts. They contained the private investigator files Estelle had commissioned years ago. I read the summary on the very first page, and the air left my lungs. Graham Vale was not a consultant. He was a man with a long history of gambling debts. And more importantly, he was Caroline's biological father. Veronica had spent the last 25 years aggressively preaching about the sanctity of the Sterling bloodline. She had treated me as a lesser entity and barred my children from her presence because we did not fit her genetic aesthetic. Yet, she had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from a children's charity to pay hush money to a man who proved her beloved. Perfect Daughter carried absolutely no sterling heritage either. The audacity of her hypocrisy was almost difficult to process. She had built her entire social empire on a foundation of stolen charity funds and a fabricated genetic legacy. Estelle had kept this devastating secret locked in a steel box, knowing that releasing it prematurely would only cause unnecessary chaos. She had waited for the exact moment Veronica tried to use bloodlines as a weapon against the innocent. Hypocrisy has a price. I stared at the forensic audit, feeling a profound sense of vindication settling over me. But Arthur was not finished. He reached into the very bottom of the grey lockbox and brought out a small, plain white envelope. "Your grandmother was a formidable strategist," Arthur said, his tone softening slightly. "But she was also a woman who loved her family very much. She wanted you to have this. For the boys?" I took the envelope. It was surprisingly light. I broke the seal and tipped it over the mahogany desk. Two smaller rectangular objects slid out and clattered against the wood. They were thick, premium plastic cards on branded lanyards. I picked one up, my fingers tracing the embossed lettering. It was a lifetime VIP access pass for the elite ski resort in Aspen. I looked at the name stamped in bright silver foil across the bottom. Noah Sterling Guest. I picked up the second card. Samuel Sterling Guest. I stared at the two passes. The slick plastic blurring slightly as tears I refused to shed pricked the corners of my eyes. For 7 years, I had believed my sons were invisible to this family. I had believed they were nothing but an inconvenience to be hidden away. But Estelle had seen them. She had bought these passes years ago, securing their permanent right to enjoy the mountain long before they were even old enough to walk in the snow. If finding out someone secretly loved and protected your children would break you in the best way, drop a heart in the comments below. She had claimed a space for them in the world when Veronica was busy trying to erase them from it. She told me to give these to you when the time was right, Arthur said softly. She said that one day, those boys would need to know they were never written out of the story. Only small, selfish people tried to crop children out of the frame. I closed my hand around the two plastic cards, holding them tight against my palm. The anger I had felt earlier that morning had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet, immovable strength. I looked at the financial audits, the trust documents, and the time-stamped evidence of Veronica's cruelty. I neatly stacked the papers and placed them into my leather briefcase. I looked up at Arthur, who was already reaching for his suit jacket. The anniversary gala begins tomorrow evening, I said, my voice perfectly level. Draft the eviction notices. We were going to Aspen. The drive up the winding mountain roads to Aspen was beautiful. The pine trees were heavy with fresh powder, and the sky was a brilliant, piercing blue. I drove my practical SUV, and Arthur sat in the passenger seat, quietly reviewing a stack of legal injunctions. We did not speak much. There was no need for grand speeches. We were simply two professionals arriving at a job site to execute a planned demolition. We pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the Sterling Lodge just as the sun began to set behind the peaks. The property was completely transformed. Valets in crisp white winter coats were rushing to park a line of luxury black cars. A massive, clear heated tent had been erected on the back lawn, glowing with amber fairy lights and the flash of professional photography. The air smelled of wood smoke and expensive catered food. Veronica had truly outdone herself for the 50th anniversary PR campaign. Arthur and I walked up the heated stone pathway toward the main entrance. I was wearing my dark navy parka, the same practical style I had worn as an 8-year-old child standing in the snow. I did not belong in this glossy magazine spread, and I did not care. We bypassed the guest check-in line and stepped directly into the grand foyer. The room was packed with the elite of the city, holding champagne flutes and laughing softly. Almost immediately, the crowd parted slightly. Veronica was marching toward us. She wore an emerald green gown that swept the floor, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression a mask of tightly controlled fury. She stopped 3 feet away from me, her eyes darting nervously toward the nearby guests before snapping back to my face. "I explicitly told you not to come," she hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "You are completely ruining the optics of this evening." She glanced at Arthur, recognizing the firm's senior partner, and a flicker of genuine panic crossed her features. "Arthur, whatever she has dragged you here for, it can wait until Monday," Veronica said, trying to regain her authoritative tone. "This is a private and family celebration. Morgan is leaving right now." I looked at her, standing in the house I had secretly paid to maintain for nearly a decade. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. She had no idea. I unclasped my leather briefcase. The quiet click of the metal latch sounded remarkably loud over the low hum of the string quartet playing in the next room. I pulled out the black-bound ledger I had printed the night before. I stepped past Veronica, moving toward a small, pristine white cocktail table standing near the grand staircase. Several guests had stopped talking, their eyes drawn to the sudden shift in the room's energy. "I am not leaving," Veronica, I said, my voice projecting clearly without requiring volume. I placed the black ledger squarely in the centre of the white tablecloth. You mentioned that this was a private space for the real family. You mentioned that I was ruining the optics. I tapped the cover of the ledger with my index finger. This book contains 108 receipts, $5,500, paid every single month, for 9 years. Veronica's face went completely rigid. "Shut your mouth," she whispered harshly, stepping closer to try and block the table from view, but I stepped sideways, keeping the ledger entirely visible. "I have paid the property taxes, the structural insurance, and the winter maintenance fees for this lodge," I continued, speaking as calmly as if I were delivering a structural audit to a city council. "I have funded the illusion of your wealth for nearly a decade." A murmur rippled through the guests standing closest to us. Caroline, holding a microphone for a PR interview, froze near the fireplace, staring at her mother in confusion. Arthur stepped forward smoothly, opening his own leather portfolio. He did not look at the guests. He looked directly at Veronica. "Mrs. Sterling," Arthur said, his tone carrying the chilling weight of absolute legal authority. "As the appointed trustee of the Estelle Sterling Irrevocable Trust, I am serving you with formal notice." He handed her a crisp, single sheet of paper bearing a heavy red seal. "By explicitly attempting to exclude minor beneficiaries from this property to serve personal public relations interests, you have materially breached the Equal Hearth Clause." Veronica stared at the paper, her hands beginning to tremble as the words swam before her eyes. "Effective immediately," Arthur stated clearly. "Your right to occupy, utilise, or host events upon this property is permanently revoked." The eviction had begun. The string quartet in the adjacent room seemed to falter, a single violin note dragging out uncomfortably before fading into absolute silence. The grand foyer of the Sterling Lodge was suddenly devoid of the ambient chatter that had filled it moments before. Veronica's face shifted from a mask of pristine outrage to a rigid, chalky white. She looked at the single sheet of paper Arthur held, but she refused to take it. She crossed her arms tightly over her emerald green gown, a defensive posture that betrayed the panic rising in her chest. "This is completely absurd," Veronica said, her voice rising an octave, shrill and unsteady. She looked around at the guests, attempting to force a dismissive laugh. "You cannot simply walk into my home with fabricated documents and declare an eviction. This house belongs to the Sterling bloodline. It belongs to the legacy of this family, not to a bitter stepdaughter throwing a financial tantrum." She pointed a manicured finger at me. "You do not possess a single drop of the dedication it takes to run this empire. You never belonged here." I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply reached into my leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out the thick, bound stack of forensic audit reports that Arthur had retrieved from the safe. I set them on the white cocktail table, right next to the ledger of my maintenance payments. "If we are going to discuss dedication to the family legacy," I said evenly, "then we should discuss the financial integrity of the Sterling Winter Hearth Fund." I watched Veronica's eyes lock onto the logo of the independent auditing firm on the cover of the report. The last trace of colour drained from her cheeks. "For 10 years, you have overseen the disbursement of charity funds meant for orphaned children," I continued, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear. "And for 10 years, you have authorised quarterly private settlements to a man named Graham Vale." The name hung in the cold, still air of the foyer. Behind Veronica, Caroline stepped forward, the microphone slipping slightly in her grip. "Who is Graham Vale?" Caroline asked, her voice small and confused. She looked from her mother to me. I did not want to hurt her, but the structural integrity of the truth required it. He is a man with extensive gambling debts, I told Caroline quietly. And according to the private investigation files Estelle commissioned 25 years ago, he is your biological father. Veronica gasped, stepping back as if physically struck. She had spent a quarter of a century weaponizing the concept of the pristine sterling bloodline against me, using it as a justification to treat me as a secondary citizen. All the while, she had been illegally siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from a children's charity to pay hush money, desperate to hide the fact that her own perfect daughter carried no sterling heritage whatsoever. The silence was deafening. The revelation did not cause an immediate explosion. It caused a slow, agonizing disintegration. I watched as the reality of the forensic audit settled over the guests standing in the foyer. These were the elite members of society, investors, and board members who had trusted Veronica to manage their philanthropic contributions. They were looking at her now, not as a grieving widow or a dedicated matriarch, but as an embezzler. The beautiful composition she had spent decades curating was shattering before her eyes. Caroline lowered the microphone entirely. She stared at her mother, her pristine white ski suit suddenly looking fragile and absurd. "Is it true?" Caroline whispered. Veronica did not answer her daughter. Instead, she turned her fury entirely on me. The polished, elegant woman vanished, replaced by someone erratic and unhinged. She began to shout, her words echoing harshly off the massive timber beams of the lodge. She screamed about how much she had sacrificed to build the company's public image. She screamed that my father would be ashamed of me, that I was ungrateful, and that I had maliciously orchestrated this spectacle to ruin her life. She was losing her temper, her volume, and her dignity all at once. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the white cocktail table. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. When someone is dismantling their own reputation in public, the best response is simply to let them work. Arthur stepped forward, signalling to the private security personnel he had arranged to wait outside. "Mrs. Sterling, the local authorities have already been briefed on the trust violation and the eviction notice," he stated calmly over her shouting. "You and your guests have until midnight to vacate the premises. The financial audits have been forwarded to the appropriate regulatory boards." Veronica stopped screaming. She looked around the room, realizing that not a single person was moving to defend her. The society friends she had bought and paid for with lavish dinners were actively avoiding her gaze, slowly backing away toward the coat check. I looked at her one last time. "You spent your entire life polishing the windows. Veronica," I said, my voice cutting through the remaining tension. But Estelle was reinforcing the foundation, and she knew exactly when you would break it. I picked up my briefcase. I did not wait to watch the security guards escort her out. I walked past the silent guests, past the grand fireplace, and out the heavy front doors into the crisp mountain air. The cold wind hit my face, clean and incredibly sharp. The job was done. I did not look back. I woke up the next morning in my own bed, back in the quiet safety of the city. The sun was streaming through the blinds, casting warm squares of light on the wooden floor. I was pouring my first cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was Arthur. "Good morning, Morgan." His voice was as steady and unbothered as always. "I wanted to update you. Veronica's legal team filed an emergency injunction at 6 o'clock this morning." I stopped pouring. The coffee carafe hovered over the mug. "On what grounds?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. I was not panicked. I knew Veronica would not surrender her kingdom without a final, desperate clawing at the walls. "They are attempting to invalidate the irrevocable trust entirely," Arthur explained smoothly. "They submitted a petition claiming that Estelle suffered from cognitive decline at the time the documents were signed. They are arguing elder abuse and undue influence. It was a classic, ruthless tactic. By challenging Estelle's mental capacity, Veronica hoped to freeze the eviction, freeze the financial audits, and buy herself enough time to restructure the narrative. She thought the threat of a long drawn-out competency trial would force us into a quiet settlement. She thought she had found a hidden doorway back into the fortress. She was entirely wrong. "How did you respond?" I asked. Taking a sip of the hot coffee, I could practically hear Arthur smiling on the other end of the line. "I did not respond with an argument," he said. "I responded with the files from the bottom of the grey lockbox. I submitted our counter-response 30 minutes ago. The judge has already reviewed it." Arthur detailed the exact documents he had forwarded to the court. He included a sworn, notarized affidavit from a board-certified neurologist, dated the exact day Estelle signed the trust, confirming her absolute mental clarity. More importantly, he included a time-stamped video recording. Estelle had insisted on being filmed while reading the equal hearth clause aloud, stating clearly that she anticipated Veronica would one day attempt this exact legal maneuver. The emergency injunction was dead on arrival. The judge dismissed Veronica's petition with prejudice before 9 o'clock in the morning, citing an overwhelming abundance of preventative evidence. Veronica had lunged for the killing blow, only to realise the blade was made of paper. Her legal counterattack had lasted less than 3 hours. She was out of options, out of money, and officially out of the lodge. The house was mine. The fallout was swift and merciless. When you construct a life entirely out of optics, the destruction of those optics is absolute. By the end of the week, the story of the Sterling Winter Hearth Fund had leaked to the financial press. The regulatory boards opened a formal investigation into the misappropriation of charity assets. Veronica was immediately and unceremoniously ousted from the corporate board of directors to protect the company's remaining stock value. I watched the news segments from the quiet comfort of my living room, sipping tea while Noah and Sam did their homework at the kitchen table. The television displayed footage of Veronica walking rapidly to her car, shielding her face from the cameras with a designer handbag. The society friends who had eagerly attended her extravagant galas released public statements distancing themselves from her actions. She was stripped of her gala chairmanships and her exclusive country club memberships. The empire she had sacrificed everything to maintain burned to ashes in a matter of days. I felt no vindictive joy watching the broadcasts. There was no grand celebration in my house. I simply felt a profound, settling sense of closure. The ledgers were finally balanced. The structure had been righted. I had spent 32 years believing that I was the flaw in the family dynamic, the awkward piece that did not fit. Now, the world knew exactly who had introduced the rot. My architectural firm saw a sudden influx of high-profile clients. People appreciate professionals who demonstrate quiet competence under extreme pressure. I hired 3 new junior architects and expanded my office space. I did not change my lifestyle. I did not buy a new car or move into a larger house. Wealth, I had learned, is not about the things you display. It is about the ability to control your own environment and protect the people within it. I received the final keys to the Sterling Lodge via certified mail on a Thursday. Arthur included a brief note confirming that the locks had been changed and the security systems fully updated. The property was secure. The sprawling mountain estate, with its massive timber beams and stone fireplaces, was completely empty. It was waiting for a new purpose. It was waiting to be something more than a hollow stage for a fabricated family. I began drafting new blueprints. 2 weeks after the gala, the receptionist at my firm buzzed my office. She sounded slightly unsure. "Morgan, there is a Caroline Sterling here to see you." "She does not have an appointment." I looked up from the CAD drawings on my monitors. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "Send her in," I said. The door opened, and Caroline stepped into the room. I hardly recognised her. The flawless socialite armour was completely gone. She wore a simple beige sweater and dark jeans. There was no makeup, no camera crew, and no trace of the arrogant sneer she used to wear like a uniform. She looked exhausted, carrying the heavy weight of a life built on a lie. She stood awkwardly near the doorway, her hands tucked into her pockets. "I am not here to ask for money," Caroline said quickly, her voice wavering slightly. "I know my mother's accounts are frozen. I know the trust is locked. I just needed to say it to your face." She paused, looking down at the carpet before meeting my eyes. I did not know about the charity funds. I did not know she was paying my biological father to stay away. My entire life, my career, my identity. It was all just a public relations project to her. I leaned back in my chair. I did not feel pity, but I recognised the hollow realisation in her eyes. It was the same realisation I had carried for years, the knowledge that you are a pawn in someone else's game. "You participated in the exclusion," I stated calmly. "You enjoyed the privileges of the stage she built. But I believe you were unaware of the financial crimes keeping it afloat." Caroline nodded slowly, a single tear escaping her eye, which she wiped away furiously. "I do not know who I am without the sterling brands," she admitted quietly. "I have no real skills. But I read in the trade papers what you plan to do with the lodge in Aspen, the charity centre." She took a deep breath. "I know how to organise events. I know how to handle logistics. I am asking for a job. A real job." I looked at the woman who had once deemed my children too dramatic for a family vacation. I did not offer a warm embrace, and I did not offer immediate, unconditional forgiveness. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a standard employment form. "This is a 90-day probationary contract," I said, sliding it across the desk. "You will be paid a standard administrative salary. You will report directly to my operations manager. If you perform well, we will discuss an extension." It was a boundary, clear and firm. The door remained slightly ajar. 14 months later, the heavy winter snow returned to Aspen, blanketing the mountain in pristine white. I stood on the grand wooden deck of the Sterling Lodge, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The massive outdoor stone fire pit roared, sending sparks dancing into the crisp evening air. But the atmosphere surrounding the property was entirely different. The exclusive, suffocating silence of Veronica's perfectly curated galas had been permanently erased. The lodge was full of life. It was filled with the loud, joyful, unpolished sounds of children who were simply allowed to be themselves. Following the legal eviction and the establishment of my full ownership, I had spent the better part of a year executing a comprehensive architectural redesign. I did not tear down the historic timber framing or the beautiful stone masonry. I simply altered the function of the space. The grand dining room, once reserved for elite society dinners, was now a communal gathering area. The Sterling Lodge was officially reopened as a fully funded, free winter retreat for families navigating the complex journey of foster care and adoption. I walked back inside, the warmth of the central hearth wrapping around me. In the corner of the great room, a massive pile of neon snow boots, heavy gloves, and colourful winter jackets sat in glorious, chaotic disarray. It was not a perfect composition for a luxury magazine. It was a beautiful, functional mess. I watched Noah and Sam running past the staircase, chasing a new friend they had made that morning. Around their necks, swinging wildly as they moved, were the premium plastic VIP ski passes Estelle had secured for them a decade ago. They wore those passes like armour. They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that their great-grandmother had claimed this mountain for them before they could even walk. They were not guests here. They were not aesthetic inconveniences to be pushed to the edge of the frame. They were the absolute centre of the picture. I sat down in a heavy leather chair near the fire, watching families who had chosen each other share meals and trade stories of fierce resilience. Bloodlines are an accident of biology. They do not guarantee loyalty, and they certainly do not guarantee love. Veronica had built an empire worshipping a genetic lottery while simultaneously hiding the truth of her own daughter's origins. She had lost everything because she valued the illusion of an exclusive bloodline over the reality of genuine human connection. The families filling my lodge this week understood the exact opposite. They knew that a true family is something you intentionally build, piece by piece, with absolute dedication. I looked at the massive stone fireplace. On the mantel, replacing the old, heavily cropped portrait of Veronica and my father, was a simple framed photograph of Estelle. She was smiling, her sharp eyes looking out over the room she had designed. She had built the maze. I had simply navigated it. And now, the sprawling, historic estate was serving its ultimate purpose. It was sheltering people who truly needed the warmth. The house was warm. There is a distinct kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your life trying to fit into a space that was explicitly designed to reject you. For 32 years, I carried the quiet, heavy burden of being the stepdaughter on the periphery. I paid my monthly ransom of $5,500. I accepted the subtle slights. I allowed myself to be pushed out of the photographs, believing that if I was just accommodating enough, silent enough, and useful enough, the architecture of the family would eventually expand to include me and my sons. I was completely wrong. Toxic structures do not expand to accommodate grace. They simply consume it. Veronica never wanted a family member. She wanted a silent patron to fund her delusions of grandeur. She wanted an audience for her flawlessly curated, entirely fabricated performance of elite society life. The moment I stopped paying for my ticket, the moment I stopped being a compliant utility, the entire performance collapsed. Sometimes, I still think about the day Arthur handed me the forensic audits from the grey lockbox. I think about the sheer volume of lies required to maintain Veronica's pristine public image. It is exhausting just to contemplate. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried under charity galas and society columns, has a remarkable way of eventually finding the light. It just needs someone willing to follow the paper trail. If you are listening to this and you recognise that familiar ache in your chest, I need you to hear this clearly. Do not spend another year of your life standing out in the cold, waiting for a locked door to magically open. Stop trying to prove your worth to people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. Your value is not determined by an invitation to an exclusive table. Your value is determined by your refusal to sit on the floor. When I finally walked into Arthur's office and read the brilliant, uncompromising legal framework my grandmother had quietly established, I realised something profound about inheritance. We are taught that a legacy is a passive gift, a collection of assets handed down from one generation to the next. But true legacy is rarely passive. It requires action. Legacy is not what you casually inherit from a quiet reading of a will. It is what you aggressively protect from those who try to illegitimately claim it. Estelle left me the legal right to the Sterling Lodge, but I had to find the courage to actually enforce the boundary. I had to become the architect of my own closure. I had to stop apologising for taking up space. Today, the foundation of my life is immovable. It is built on the joyful noise of my children, the solid framework of the truth, and the absolute certainty that I owe nothing to the people who once tried to erase me. If you have ever had to build your own table because they would not give you a seat, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell them to stop paying the maintenance fee for a family that does not exist. Tell them to claim their own space. The The door clicked shut.